This is how I went from drawing poses like this to these delicious poses in 2 hours as a beginner artist with no art education. Hold up. The results don't even look like the final product. So why does this matter? Well, these are some of my favorite art that utilizes a lot of different poses and thereby making the art look so much more interesting. Behind that art is this. This is the practice that is needed to get to that point. A lot of practicing gestures and being comfortable drawing these gestures, drawing this movement, which is what this video is about. Establishing the foundations to get to that point. In this video, I'll be showing you how to practice gesture drawing in 3 steps, from finding a good reference photo to practice from, how to draw basic gestures from those photos, and finally, how to apply anatomy concepts onto those photos so they look more realistic. So let's get into it. The first step is to find reference pictures and start with simple poses that you're most likely going to use, whether that's standing, sitting, walking, etc. Harder and more complicated poses like these people doing parkour can be really difficult, and without the practice, it can really discourage us early on from doing these exercises. So we'll start simple and ramp up from there. Here's some resources I use to find free references for your poses. And they're pretty cool because they can let you customize the types of references, whether you want them clothed or not, and any kind of gender. And yeah, it's just a pretty cool resource to have. The second step is to get a feel for it. Set a time limit and draw as much as you can in 1 or 2 minutes. Don't feel the need to make it perfect or exactly the same as the reference picture. The important part here is to understand the big idea of the pose, which is the primary shape and form of the pose. Let's do an example. Here I laid out the primary form first in red, which is the main flow of the pose. It follows the head, the spine, and the end of the toe, and this is like the big idea of the gesture and kind of sets the tone for the rest of the drawing. I usually choose the most exaggerated movement as my primary pose, as it usually is what draws the most attention in the gesture, so I want to make sure I get that right first before moving on to the rest of the pose. After the primary form, we can draw the next set of lines that shows what the arms and the other leg is doing. This would be the secondary forms, and I've outlined them in blue. And with that, both primary and secondary forms should communicate the basic idea of what the person is doing. And we've got the basic gesture done. There's 2 key tips that I want you guys to remember before we move on to the next step. The first one is that we shouldn't copy every single detail. As mentioned before, we want to focus on the big idea of the pose and get those proportions and the energy right before we move on to the details. The second tip is to set a timer, and this will help with the first tip because we don't have all the time we want, so we're kind of forced to focus on the basic outline. A resource I recommend are these ones by Carolyn Peters. She has a couple of videos that share some do's and don'ts, as well as a more tutorial style video of how to practice. These videos taught me how to outline the primary form first and how the rest of the details can come later. The next step is, once you can capture the main form and shape of the gesture, you can start applying shapes to it. Simplifying into shape blocks can help you understand how to shape the forms when you want to add dimension to it. To start, I like to think about the body in 3 major blocks: the head, the ribcage, and the pelvis. And then just connect the lines for the other parts of the body. I find this concept similar to how I plan my vacation trips. I plan my itinerary on a couple of major attractions I want to see, and then deciding other stuff like logistics, food, and lodging becomes easier because they are informed by these decisions. So likewise, the placement of these major masses should inform the placement of your other body parts and make it easier for you. You can draw these markers as squares or circles or a mix of both, whatever you feel comfortable to represent these blocks. For me personally, I like to switch it up. For poses that are more circular, like this ice skating pose where there's a lot more protrusion in the body shape, I like to use circles, while for this other standing pose where she's slightly turning, I use this rectangular block to represent her sides better. Either way, practice and do what feels easier for you. Once I identify where these masses are in the reference, I added the pelvis, the ribcage, and then connected them together. Then I drew the head, mapped the kneecaps, and then connected the lines together. In some places like the thighs, the calves, and the glutes, I added some more weight in them because these are the areas with more muscle or fat. And that's it. Your shapes are done, and now I'm just erasing some of these guidelines to prep them for a more finished result. I use this one biceppose.com when I'm unsure what the body is doing when they're doing certain poses. In this particular picture, I think the picture is doing a good job in showing what every joint in the body is doing. But in some cases where the pose is hard to understand, like this sword lunging one, I used it to understand a little bit more about what the torso is doing when it's in that kind of motion. Plus there's a lot of foreshortening too, so I use it to understand like what are the masses that are being foreshortened. This website helps me simplify this movement more so I can help set the shapes that I need. Because sometimes it's hard to get that information from the picture itself because there's a lot of shadow, a lot of colors, a lot of noise going. The last step is to learn anatomy so you can accurately capture the shapes of the human body when it's in a pose. Not only will this make your art look more realistic, but understanding what causes the different lines and shadows in the human body will help you simplify those structures later on. I'll make a separate video talking more in depth about this. In the meantime, here's some resources I use to study anatomy. I used Marc Brunet's full body anatomy crash course to get familiar with all the important muscle groups that artists pay attention to. There's a ton of muscles in the body, but there's only a subset that will really show outwardly. So unless you're a doctor or you're really into drawing all the different muscles, you really only need to know some of it. So Marc does a really good job in summarizing all these muscle groups that make up the outward appearance of a person. Now the next resource that I use is Zygote's 3D model of a human body, because this brings together everything you'll learn in Marc's video. This will help showcase what it actually looks like in real life underneath layers of skin and fat, and whether you need to spend a lot of time drawing it. Finally, I use this website to see how an artist simplifies the muscle group as a drawing so I can implement that to my own drawings. So those are the 3 steps I've found that were foundational for beginners like me who want to draw various poses of the human body. From finding good references to drawing basic gestures to supplementing those basic forms with the more defined muscle groups. Personally, I'm still getting a hang of implementing those shapes and the anatomy organs into my gestures, because I think it's one thing to draw shapes in a movement or have a rough idea of the shapes that are in the movement, but it's another to portray the actual organs of a body in movement. But overall, practicing gesture drawing has been very valuable in my art journey, because in the past I've actually never practiced gesture drawing, so a lot of the drawings that I made were really stiff, especially when it comes to the full human body. And I've actually avoided drawing the full human body and opted in for more headshots. Or if I were to draw a full body, I would actually use a lot of things to cover the human body, because I knew that the body that I drew didn't look very good, didn't look what I had in my mind. And applying its principles have for sure made me more confident in being able to portray bodies in movement, or basically like the full human body in different and more interesting poses, which is something I'm going to incorporate in all of my drawings moving forward.